4 years on from the start of the protests that unseated Hosni Mubarak, how much has Egypt really changed? The military said then it was taking the side of the revolution. But was it really just protecting its own future and its own interests? This is Inside Story. Hello there, welcome to the programme. I'm Shuli Ghosh. 4 years after a revolution that shook Egypt and the Middle East, some Egyptians wonder what has changed. It took just 18 days to turn the page on Hosni Mubarak's near 30-year rule. But the rallying cry for bread, freedom and social justice remains largely unfulfilled. Unemployment, particularly among the young, is now higher than in the Mubarak era. Thousands of activists and opposition figures have been rounded up and arrested. And a military leader is now back in control of the presidency. Well, the Egyptian army has, of course, long played a central role in the country's politics. And when the uprising began, many watched to see how the military would react. After an initial period of silence, and perhaps aware of the changing political order, the army announced that it would side with the revolution. And after Hosni Mubarak was forced from power, it was the generals who took charge in a military-led transition. Mohamed Morsi became the first civilian president in Egypt's modern history in 2012. But still, the constitution written under the Morsi presidency protected the privileges of the Egyptian military. And in the end, following protests against his rule, Mohamed Morsi was forced out in a military coup. And a military man, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, is once again the country's president. So a lot to talk about. Let's bring in our guests. Joining us for the discussion in Washington, D.C. is Tawfiq Hamid. He's a political commentator and author of the book Inside Jihad. In Dallas, Texas, we have Sahar Aziz, Associate Professor of Law at Texas A&M University and author of Bringing Down and Uprising, Egypt's Stillborn Revolution. And on Skype from Vancouver in Canada is Adel Iskandar, Professor of Global Communication at Simon Fraser University and author of the book Egypt in Flux, Essays on an Unfinished Revolution. Welcome to all three of you to the show. Tawfiq, let's start with you. Are we back now to a Mubarak-style era with the military shaping Egypt's politics, or is it in fact more authoritarian under Sisi than it was under Mubarak?
Look, let me be very clear about certain things. First of all, the military has been the most established and organized system in the country. So trying to weaken the system without, or the military here, without having an alternative organized civilian power or parties or political power can end in disasters, because if the military is weakened, like we have seen in Iraq, for example, they were controlled as a country during a very bad regime, for example. And once the military is weakened, you give rise here in such circumstances to disorganized power like the Islamists, the radicals to come.
How would it weaken the military to allow other political parties? Even Mubarak tolerated other political parties.
No, you don't need to weaken the military. You need a transitional stage, and that is the problem to begin with. This is what I warned 7 years ago about what I call the sudden democracy syndrome. The society needs to change first. Enlightenment has to happen first, like what happened in Europe. Then you can change the system. But what happened in Egypt was change at the top level without changing the people themselves.
It was a democratic change. Mohamed Morsi was a democratically elected president.
Yeah, but the people revolted against him as they did against Mubarak.
Some people did.
And there is no reason. We are talking here about 30 million people at least were in the streets. We have seen them, and there are many witnesses for that. There is no doubt about that the people turned against Morsi. Otherwise, you would have seen millions of people, for example, today, turning against the current regime. But we have not seen millions today. It's obvious that the power of the radical Islamists has been weakened despite the terror acts they are trying to do. But their ability to bring people to the streets has been significantly limited.
Adel,
so
let me bring in
say...
Adel, because I want to, that's a very good point that you make. It is true, isn't it, Adel, that the army's intervention in both removing Mubarak and then removing Morsi was widely welcomed by the public. It was seen as the army taking the side of the people. Is that the case?
Yes, I mean, for at least for history's sake, the military has been very crafty and extremely clever at being able to situate itself in the best possible manner in the eyes of those who've been wanting to topple subsequent regimes. So, in the case of the removal of Hosni Mubarak, the military played its cards correctly and appeared to be siding with the revolution and was received very positively in that regard. And shortly thereafter, with the massive protests against Mohamed Morsi, again, the military played its hand extremely well, not only supporting and sponsoring and endorsing the protest movement, but when it did come to sort of a climactic moment, they appeared to be sort of salvaging the country, or again, it's discursive, but it was very successful, and has anchored their popularity moving forward. So yes, this is a position that remains incredibly prominent and prevalent in Egyptian society.
But isn't it the case, Adel, do you think it's the case that the army intervened in those situations because it was for the good of the country, or actually is it because it was for the good of itself?
Well, right now, I think it is fairly clear that the military perceives the good of the country as the good of, as what is best for the military. That the two are basically not only in tandem, but are sort of married to one another. That in the absence of a military that is capable of maintaining its contiguity and playing a significant role in the country's economics, then basically the country is on the right track. Anything short of that is perceived as instability, chaos, anarchy, all these other problems. So again, the question here is an issue of discourse. The military has been successful at producing a discourse that has resonated with a sizable, not all Egyptians, of course. We can no longer talk about all Egyptians anymore. There's no such thing as the people of Egypt. The people of Egypt are a fragmented entity. There are different constituencies. They see the world differently. But nevertheless, a sizable proportion currently, at this very moment, perceive the military and the state and the public at large as one unitary whole. Okay. And that's problematic.
Sahar, do you agree with that? A strong military is seen as being critical for a strong Egypt, even though this was a revolution that was meant to make Egypt more open and more democratic?
I think this concept is antiquated. It was a very common belief that the military was a modernizing force after colonialism. So it's a very post-colonial 1950s, 1960s, and even up to the 1970s. But what we saw, for example, in Latin America, when we had this wave of democratization, is that, in fact, if you allow the military to rule for too long, it actually becomes counterproductive. And so the problem with having a military run any government, not just specific to Egypt, is that they tend not to be structured or trained to create the political space so that you can have the transition to meaningful democracy. So as Tawfiq had mentioned, there needs to be alternatives. There need to be political parties. The public needs to have opportunities to learn how to play the game of democracy. The problem that Egyptians have had is that no government has allowed them to do that. And that has been directly related to the fact that the presidents are military generals or former military generals. Well, Hosni Mubarak
at least allowed other political groups and other entities like the judiciary, like the police, did have some level of power. Now it seems that all the supreme power is with the military and all those other groups are just followers.
Well, the military has always had a lot of influence. It was just behind a curtain. Now it's opened the curtain and it is governing and ruling, as opposed to simply ruling behind the scenes. But there is a consolidation of power in terms of the military being at the apex, whereas before the military was kind of second next to the Gamal Mubarak and Alat Mubarak's business elites, which was one of the reasons why they supported the revolution, which ultimately became an uprising and now has become, in my opinion, a reversion back to a authoritarianism. So the militaries have a very important role to play. They should engage in national security and protect the nation, but they are not trained to be governors, and they are not trained to allow for criticism and for the political space necessary for Egyptians to be able to work it out among themselves and figure out how they're going to elect leaders, how they're going to remove leaders in a peaceful, transparent, democratic way.
Yeah, and you raised a very important point there about this perceived clash between the army's economic interests and perhaps other business interests, which it didn't want to go against those. Taufik, we know the army has huge economic interests. One person it didn't want in power was Gamal Mubarak, whose business interests collided with theirs. So how much of what the army does is motivated by its economic interests?
I see the interest of the army in economic things is based on its nationalism. The army provides to a great extent the cheap products for relatively poor people.
Really, it's based on nationalism, not on a love of profits.
Not necessarily for profit, yeah, and it's self-sustained to a great extent. Like, for example, they do agriculture so that the soldiers do not become a burden on the government. Also, it's vital really to note here that the current government in Egypt are virtually all civilians. So it's unfair to say that there is a military control for full control over the country. And also the policy of the country is to encourage business people. Even during Mubarak time,
but
the business people played
a role. It has huge interests in the economy. So some estimates put the army's control of the economy at up to 40%.
And we have seen also estimates as low as 10%, and the gap is huge. But in general, the army at least does not hold the money and the control within few individuals as during the business elite era. As you mentioned. So what I'm saying here is the army, yes, is involved to some extent in the economy, but it allows a space, a reasonable space for the private sector and to protect the poor people. Sometimes the army need to intervene and
sure
have
Sahar
some role.
And
that is the problem.
What do you guys think about that? Adil, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think the opacity of the military's role in the economy is something worth noting. It may not necessarily be, people in fatigue who are in charge of the various institutions of the state, as well as the private sector, but it is basically a cadre of retired generals. And these are individuals whose ties to the military remain quite strong. But I think there's something important to say here, and going back to Sahar's point about the military being at the apex, it's absolutely critical to not be dragged into sort of what is otherwise a fictitious view that the military is basically subduing all of the other institutions of the state. I think what's happening today in Egypt is that you have what appears to be a complete harmony, whereby the institutions of the deep state, the role of the former regime, as well as the bureaucracy itself, is actually working in concert with the military, willfully and out of conviction. They are ideologically supportive of the military. They believe that it's in their best interest, that the integrity of the state needs to be held together, and that the military is the only institution capable of shepherding it right now. So to assume that there's a competition between these institutions, or that it's a very precarious situation, that the military is basically suffocating dissent within the institution of the state, I think it's a mischaracterization of what's happening now. And really, all of this is happening with with this really anchored, jingoistic, hyper-patriotic, ultra-nationalistic, militarized view of Egypt's future, and it is resonating. I'm not, as problematic as it is, and as critical as we must be of this, because of what it means, and previous examples of similar nation states being governed in the same fashion, whether it's in Central America, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa.
Well, let's see what Sahar thinks of that. So Adil is saying that the military works in harmony with other institutions. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it all depends on who you're working against. So in 2013, there was a clear ideological fault line between political Islamists, which ranged from very moderate to very extreme, to those who believed in a more secular civilian state where religion should really be limited to the home and the private life. And during that clash of ideologies, there was a convergence of interest. And many people, many institutions were willing to back the military's efforts to essentially, push Morsi out of power, which is arguably, and I think from a legal perspective, a military coup. But right now what you're seeing is you're going to start seeing fragmentation and fracturing within the political system. And even Sisi was trying to figure out for many months how he's going to shape his parliament. And so I don't think that convergence of interest is going to last very long, because ultimately it's about a fight for the crony capitalist patronage clientele system in which the economy is distributed, or economic goods and resources are distributed in a very corrupt way based on the inner elite circle of whoever's in power. And right now that's going to be the former military folks and maybe a little bit of the domestic security and national security groups. But I think you're going to start seeing some clashes for fighting for resources.
Well, let's just give our viewers some background on the military's involvement in the economy. Egypt's military, of course, has a huge stake in the country's industry and business, and that goes back for decades. Companies owned by the army produce everything from pasta and cooking oil to bottled water and cement. The military is also Egypt's biggest landowner. A 1997 law granted it control over all unowned coastal areas, a big part of which has been sold to developers. And the Egyptian government often awards contracts to the army directly, allowing it to sidestep any bidding process. One of the biggest projects in Egypt right now is the massive redevelopment of the Suez Canal. That was awarded to a consortium led by the army. Taufik, in fact, there is some speculation that Suez Canal deal was one of the reasons that Mohamed Morsi was toppled by the army, because his plans for redevelopment didn't include the army.
I don't see it as a main reason, because this cannot explain
I'm not
the
saying
millions
it's a
of
main
people.
reason, but I'm saying it is one of the reasons. The army was worried that it was going to be cut out of this multi-billion-dollar deal.
I don't see it as a powerful reality here, because the army had the chance to do this project years before Morsi. Why in this particular year everything has to change? And if they wanted to do it, they would have done it before Morsi. So I don't see this as a point that convinced me that, or can convince me that the army removed Morsi for a personal interest.
And of course, and we'll never know, because the army doesn't allow any speculation or talk about what its business interests or what kind of profit it makes. It's unaudited, it's untaxed, and contracts get awarded to it without any kind of oversight.
But remember, the army is an organization coming from the people of Egypt themselves. It's not a foreign organization or an elite group of a specific sect, for example, ruling the country. We are not like this. We are not specific sect ruling the country. This is the army of the people, coming from the people. So we cannot really separate the army here from the people. And also, we need to know that we are in a transitional situation. Removing or weakening the power of the army now can cause significant collapse of the country, and can end in chaos. And we have seen many countries when the military is weakened, especially in the Middle East. So what I'm suggesting is a gradual transition to democracy, where enlightenment of the people has to occur first. Fighting radical views and ideas need to occur first. Then we can talk about the ballot and the gradual change of the process. The sudden changes can be very destructive
here.
So,
Adil, Taufik is saying that there has to be a gradual change. I have to say, it does seem very odd to people outside Egypt that the military has quite so much economic power in a country where, for the ordinary Egyptian, there's still widespread poverty and unemployment?
Well, I mean, the military has been in this exact same position for at least 60 years. This is not new. This didn't emerge with the toppling of Morsi or
with the toppling of
Mubarak.
Morsi, there has been many more contracts awarded to the military worth nearly $2 billion, according to local news reports. And last March, Sisi signed a $40 billion deal with an Emirati construction firm to build 1 million homes for Egypt's youth. So actually, there has been a lot more money going Sisi's way since the toppling of Morsi.
Well, no, that's not what I meant to say. What I meant to say was that the military has had a monopoly on the economy since 1954. That basically, because of the opacity of the economic system in Egypt, many of these contracts were entirely invisible. The military you could not cover the military in the Egyptian press prior to the Egyptian revolution. It had to make it through a military censor. So the economic interests and assets of the military were entirely invisible to public oversight or even knowledge. So even though they've secured contracts since Morsi's removal in the billions, perhaps even in the tens of billions, the exact same interactions and the exact same transactions were happening prior. But I think it's really important for us, given that it's January 25th, to focus on the state of the revolutionaries. Where are the revolutionaries in this conversation? I think that, yes, it's important for us to look at how the military has dominated the discourse, but where are the revolutions vis-a-vis all of this?
What do you think, Adel? I mean, do you think the spirit of the revolution has been undermined, or is it still there?
Well, I mean, I think this is precisely, the problem that we have to get at. I think the nature of the revolution, or what it means to be a revolutionary today, is precisely what's problematic. Everyone in Egypt today believes that they are, in some ways, part of some revolution, whether they protested against Mubarak and his toppling, or whether they are members of the Muslim Brotherhood now who are trying to push for as opposition groups, or even if they are supporters of Mubarak himself. Many of Mubarak's supporters came out and protested on June 30th against Mohammed Morsi, and now believe that they are members of a June 30th revolution. So today, the discourse of revolution is completely fragmented, meaning that Egyptians cannot come together under a single vision of revolution that dates back to January 25th, 2011, that catapulted a huge unifying mobilization that toppled a dictator.
Okay.
And that is why the Egyptian revolution is scrambling, is divisive, and there doesn't seem to be an agreement as to where to move forward from this point forward.
Do you agree with that, Sahar? Because we've got a situation where there are thousands of political prisoners, more than 100 journalists arrested, newspapers closed down, satellite channels closed down, lawyers arrested for defending political detainees. Have we seen the spirit of that revolution undermined, or is there still optimism about the way forward?
Well, I think the revolution died on February 11th, 2011, when essentially it became a battle of the elites. Now, the military is obviously one of the members of the elite, but you have the judiciary, you have the economic elites that are still from Gamal Mubarak and Alat Mubarak's elite coalition. You have the police, the domestic security. And the biggest losers are the Egyptian people, because when you use the term revolutionaries, these are the grassroots, whether they are the middle to upper middle class youth who are enlightened, who are very highly educated on Twitter, on Facebook, saw what their peers in Western and even Eastern and Southern countries were experiencing and said, why are we behind the times? We deserve better than this. You also have the political Islamists, many of whom are moderates. They're not all extremists. Of course, there are extremists, and they're essentially ruining the reputation of political Islam altogether. And then you have the urban poor and the rural poor. So those are the biggest losers. And what you're seeing now is a battle for control of the state by elites in the same system of corruption and the same system of keeping down the grassroots, which is why you're seeing seculars, liberals, youth, and political Islamists all in jail. The street is no longer a place where people can air their grievances, and there's really no other avenue anymore for people to petition their government, air their grievances, and say, we want change and reform. So I think this is going to set up the country for more instability and perhaps another more bloody revolution.
Okay. Taufik, last word to you. Are we going to see more instability in Egypt?
I believe there will be some elements of unrest. However, I strongly believe with the unity between the police, the army, and the population of Egypt, or the majority of them at least, they will ultimately control it, and the country can be controlled.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there. I know there's lots to talk about, but we have run out of time. Thank you very much indeed to all three of my guests today, Tawfiq Hamid, Sahar Aziz and Adil Iskandar.
Thank you.
And thank you at home for watching. Do let us know what you think. You can leave your comments on the programme page on aljazeera.com, or you can go to facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. Until next time, from me, Shuli Ghosh. Bye for now.